I have taken a little time off to think because, for one thing, my carpal tunnel got really bad. And for another, the last two videos I've made were so hasty that it was very hard for me to watch them, which I like to do. I like to follow up and watch them. The material that I have here from the last few days is important enough that I'm going to make this video 2 or 3 times over the weekend so that anybody who wants to can watch one of them for Labor Day and try to come to grips with what I mean to express. The facility that I use comes up on YouTube permits a person to wait a couple of hours until sometimes it takes a full day. Sometimes I even have to upload a second time until the video has closed captions. You'll see a little CC down in the corner of the screen over here. It says CC. If you click that, it gives you auto translation. Sometimes the auto translation is inaccurate. It appears sometimes maybe even tampered with. But usually it's pretty good. So if you don't know what a screenshot is or a snipping tool, you can go into an explanation link. Find your snipping tool or your screenshot system, and you can freeze something that has a key idea in print from the closed caption. Make a screenshot and download it to your computer and save it for consideration for later. The reason I mention that is that some of my material, although fairly obvious, is being kept out of media and probably schools. And you might want to be reminded of what I had to say if you agree with me. Since these videos are free, I want to mention that Chinatown has a Walk for Rights group at the Asian Counseling Referral Service who help feed the elderly people of Chinatown, which is a wonderful commons in Seattle. You might want to make a donation to Walk for Rights if you approve of anything you hear in these videos. My life in Chinatown was happier than I ever thought it could be in the circumstances which are my life. So we live in a time when relations with Russia are fragile and need to be handled with care. But they're no longer an iron curtain. And it's not for them to tell the American people what is courteous and what is discourteous. However, I suspect that discourtesy and the lack of a graceful exit of their own for politicians who have failed, I'm sure they've tried to establish friendship with the United States. And some of this is, of course, on the United States to explain too, because many of those men in Russia seem like very reasonable people. It's true appearances can be deceiving, but Trump was also unable to accept a graceful exit. This is a very serious problem. I wouldn't be surprised if the day comes when Putin tells America what it takes to make us great again. So, although the Russians are no longer an iron curtain, we love to learn about them, watch their figure skating, read their literature, hear from their prose philosophers. The internet allows them to extend ideological surveillance all over the world, which means that they can be busybodies, about American understanding of privacy. And they can also be confused with UW Dialectical's tendency to use the opposition from their own playstations anonymously as a war toy, as they have with me, and of which I've complained to you, to the FBI, to the Homeland Security, to the police department, to UW administration. What I'd like to do is describe a little bit about who had the um, wherewithal to pigeonhole me, how they operated a little bit, why they chose me. You're calling me the chosen. And I assume what they mean is the chosen opposition. Well, I didn't choose myself for that role, and I don't see how they can go about doing that since I'm not running for any office. But I will explain what I think are some of the basic issues in play and who are the primary authorities behind this selection process. Um, America has always had dramatic tension between the right to hoard property under laws that favor capitalism and civil rights and the legitimacy of claims for the Commonwealth that people be taken care of in a welfare system. Ironically, sadly, and certainly very challengingly, something America has occasionally tried to rise to the occasion of. There's tension also between the civil rights movement and the human rights movement. People who are suffering, like the Rohingya, say you don't know how lucky you are to be oppressed in the civil rights movement the way you are oppressed. Living in Section 8 myself, as you can see. So we end up with a very convoluted situation. I don't think it's wise to mistake the MAGA or Make America Great movement as being somehow separate, different from, or in opposition to the Green Party. In fact, they're one and the same. It's very disturbing the way the NAACP has operated towards me. And I'll explain why it's disturbing, so maybe you share the feeling that it's disturbing, even if you are Black. The way that they've targeted me shows their authorship and fraternity with the MAGA Green Party circuit. When you look at someone like Huey Long, you have a politician who sometimes considered corrupt, about whom was circulated rumors of fascism and dictatorship, who was just a reasonable man, who said every man is a king and no man wears a crown. He was a man of the people. He wanted health care, he wanted schools, he bought school books. People said, "Where'd you get the money, Huey?" He bought school books. He said, "Never mind where I got the money." And when he was done in, he had so much work to do, he said, as he lay dying. His legacy was turned into a fiction by Robert Penn Warren. Now, people who know my work come up against the problem the way that I see signifiers like Warren in fictionalizing the account of American politicians' assassination. After all, that's what they did to JFK with something called the Warren Report. Now, suppose Huey Long were informed by a brilliant philosopher. And somebody set up a PlayStation to make mad political acts in his name. And then some other person came along, trot, made a movie based on a fiction book called All the King's Men. And you were to go to ask a professor, how can I learn about Louis Long? And he would say, go see All the King's Men. Well, Frank Herbert had a contemptuous phrase about academics called the ferocious quibble over a comma. But it turns out that there are reasons why we quibble. And it's not right to make a movie of a fiction of an important person who's been slandered, slanders which inform that novel and movie, and say, go see it if you want to learn about him. That's not fair. That's not reasonable. Better to quibble. No one would know that better, you would think, than the professor who even told me that. He belabored over and over again the hard work of teaching black students, excuse me, grammar skills. I would watch her crying at night till 1 in the morning after long days staying overtime in the office. Over and over again, she would work the details. She never skimped on reviewing a paper. She would cry and in exhaustion at 2 o'clock in the morning, saying under her breath, nobody cares about me, and weeping. But she always tended to these black students, white students in the community college, because she knew how important it was for them to understand punctuation, to try to understand things even as difficult as subordinate clauses. And yet, after all that punishing labor, for some reason, the mad jackals of MAGA and the Green Party chose me for torrential abuses. I've talked to the FBI about this. They just didn't want to be accused, but I wonder how maddening it must be for them and how foolish it is for them to implicate America in the British claim that the text of the Texas school book that was planted on me as a child, about which I have reported being put through a Manson ordeal, and very disturbing pictures of my condition have emerged since that was denied. How could they reasonably implicate the government in having found those letters and read them and known them in what they call an intercept? Those letters said things like, I never told you, but I disowned you, and now I am going to write you back into my will. How is it possible that the federal authorities would wink at such a scandalous broadcast of the intent to do slavery? Well, part of it has to do with the mind of Yoko Ono and the way that the people who have done this legitimize targeting me. It's UW dialectical madness that they call sociology or even military sociology. It has to do with making someone like me into a military object. Well, you can say they can't do it, but they go right ahead and do it anyway. So What does it mean to understand this extreme targeting that exposes their authorship? What does all this mean and what does it add up to? One of the things that's going on is that the government, when the grand mad hatters released the COVID-19 revolution, they conceived of it and everything up leading up to it as running an amusement park government. The amusement park government saw licentiousness and adult cinema as a public utility in the internet for education. I identified from Wattenmaker's name in the script, who gave me the nerve agent, that they had chosen me because as a little boy, I learned about the strike on Hiroshima that nobody um, feels good about. It was something we didn't understand. Had it been me, I would have demonstrated its power. And the retort to that was that if it didn't work, we would have been embarrassed. Well, we knew we had another one. So I don't buy it. But they also say that America's rigged to be at war with human rights. And they cite the U.S., not the U.S., but the ship, the St. Louis, that was stranded off Cuba and sent back to Sobibor, concentration camp in Germany, came up the coast of Florida. Well, I would have used executive authority to let them in. But that's not the point. The point is that they stashed national security documents on me as a child and said, we're choosing this one. I didn't run for anything. I never said I wanted such a rule. They appointed me. And they appointed me on the presumption that I had made those decisions. How does that operate? Well, they have a family that traces back to the Mancini family, which is the Manson family's cinema wing. And to make America great again, they're going to exterminate a lot of poor people who played along with the sexual liberation movement. When I was a child, about 6 years old, I remember the first time I really didn't like the Beatles. Now, the script is about what they say was John Lennon's murder, and that has provided a smokescreen for everything they have done. The first time I didn't like hearing the Beatles was when I was ready to like it. I'd gotten the message about, the Buddhist message that you're only as far away as your own enlightenment from true wealth. So when I saw Baby You're a Rich Man, I thought it was going to play that song. But no, it was about you have all your money in a big bag. I didn't have any money. And then they're saying even if they're wrong, they're right. And they say all this stuff was done behind their backs while they're rubbing our faces in it. So I don't really get the message when they come swinging with privilege from the trees of Africa that they're going to create a royalty and save the planet. Wattenmaker seems strangely in line with Attenborough. I met a architect who took me to see Attenborough's film, and he was into Buckminster Fuller, and Gandhi was the film he took me to. And he then locked me in a house from the inside with the man who tore my head off, named Casper, across the street from Leslie Park. They were the Salk Research Lab teams. Salk was the author of Epoch 2 Death Control and the Survival of the Wisest. Well, Attenborough and Wattenmaker and Schwarzenegger are enough alike in iambic pentameters that I wondered what gives when Greta Thunberg showed up making noxious faces and giving the kick of her boot at a thing called The Intercept. And it looked to me like she was a play being put on by the Manson cinema crowd about the human rights demands in Africa, the people on the ship St. Louis being turned away by the civil rights movement in America because there's not enough. But really, they're pointing the fingers at me. That's strange. They're pointing the finger at me while sitting in castles. Look at Boris Johnson's castles. Look at the Rolling Stones castles. They're saying the private rights make America great again. Putin is a very rich man. He will allow you to say anything at all except criticize it. Baby You're a Rich Man was one of the first times I didn't like the Beatles, but it wasn't the last time. I've heard that populism is encouraged in America by Russians because they understand that in their society and social system, a graceful exit accords leaders no dignity, not in the way that ours does. I think that's a scary oversight in their political society. But we've been being taken in by this machine system, this since Dealey Plaza was made a Venus flytrap. And when I say that, I mean that quite literally, not just because Wattenmaker showed me a Venus flytrap, but because the Carousel Club was implicated. Oh, I care, oh, sell, sell. Carousel Club was implicated by the involvement of Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby's attorney was from Star Trek and from representing the estate of Herman Goring's widow. So we see some of the masks of benevolence that go on in West Coast operations. To me, taking invasive footage of another man's private life is too loathsome even to consider. They call me chosen, but if I was J. Edgar Hoover, there would have been no Carousel Club secret tapes made of Martin Luther King. Another thing I can hardly believe is real is that the administration was presented with papers that were called the Gutter Snipes Proposal for a Group Project. These literally spelled out using me as a chosen object in a lifelong project of slavery. It's terribly indecent that UW has created its own fabricated equity system. And believe me, I don't think it means anything for equity at all. It just means the triumph of atrocious rich weirdos. When you look at the questions about America's civil rights and human rights, people will say, oh, we're not living up to our ideals by not giving everything to Africa. You mean we're not giving up our ideals by giving everything to the Axis? Because a lot of violence and military atrocity is coming out of these landscapes, and it's being attributed to American values in the struggle to establish American values in order to prevent this from happening in our name. There's even a group called Not in Our Name. Don't do that in our name. And yet, Barack Obama was one of the leaders of the crying shame of the persecution of Muslims simply for being different than us. So we're doing things that are just too loathsome to consider. And we're always saying our new loyalties are to these madmen across the water. And I don't understand how that comes across as our best chance at equity in the world. Eisenhower knew that America's role had to be very careful and frugal, that we did, in fact, behave ourselves as troops in World War II during the occupations. Now, what Fluxus says is that everything has already been written and done. That's right in the script. So when you see that horrifying and sad picture of a little girl wailing because her life is in danger from bombs, they say, well, play it again, Sam. I don't want to play it again, Sam. But in order to stop this stuff, we have to be frugal. Now, Russia says we're no longer in a unipolar world. The idea that we ever were in a unipolar world had to do with America overextending its resources. We're not in an Iron Curtain world anymore, is maybe what he means. We're in a world where people can learn and talk about things. But the West Coast is not playing by any set of rules other than Axis intelligence rules. The gay community wore a mask of magnanimity until they were ready to pounce with the Grand Hatter's COVID-19 revolution, even. So, what they did to me in terms of being the child of a dedicated community college professor was good conduct, well chastised. And one of the things that they did was call me out on what was an index system. I noticed the index system. I didn't have the word indexicalities. Dr. Cho, the mysterious Dr. Cho, gave me that word. What does that mean? What it means is that when you see something like um, Sprague as being the very important name in the House investigation into Kennedy's assassination, but also very important exterminator. It has meaning. When you hear that Carbonell and Neva Corporation had a woman named Andrea using impacted neurotrauma to play back a so-called natural language while Schulman was raiding the Carnegie to sell millions of dollars worth of stolen books. That the administration evidently could see he was doing it and let him do it for a long time. It was Schulman fever, a kind of gold fever. Andrea is also the name of a women's liver from the early 70s named Dworkin. Well, DW is DW Griffith, and Orkin is another exterminator or plumber. And they had a line about porkin. Stop Dworkin, stop porkin. Well, this is all indexed. That's part of what it means to understand that they have a Dante grand circle game going on around stealing candy from a baby, stealing the missile systems and American intelligence from Kennedy by luring him into a Venus flytrap in Dealey Plaza, and understanding what it means that the way that they have targeted me exposes their hand in authorship. It's not a response. It's a desperate gamble by a huge Axis machine that seeks to subvert our right to just be friends in a society. And they have lots of dandy ideas about why they did it. For example, sex education. People should learn. Hare never mentioned gonorrhea. Mentioned diseases and problems with coping with desertion, the problems of love, broken hearts, the problems of the force of creation, the problems of giving birth safely and raising a family. These should all be taught, but they don't want to teach it. The extremists just want to get ahead and make fear of sharing a gloat for papal privilege of some sort. Now, I'm not blaming the Pope for this. It's an elusive idea of virtue as being parochial. While they go around indexing names like Lou Brecker for, Michel Lubin. And these are names that have to be seen for what they've done. Now, of course, I knew the minute I've wept and cried about Greta Thunberg because I knew the minute I saw her that she was being taken prisoner as a human shield by that horrible Paul McCartney, who's pulled all of this stuff, falsified that story about me and John Lennon so that he could set this up. And then they call the Broadway musical Hair calls it an equity system where they have a roster of medical malpractices. Dr. Proctor was interested in hospital violence. And the NAACP has people even helping practice it as part of this phony baloney about an equity system. They call it hair pox. You know, they have an injection circuit now. At two virgins, you get injected with AIDS. And they called it found art while ignoring lines in the Texas school book like I never told you, but I disowned you, and now I'm going to write you back into my will. So I've told you quite a bit about what's really going on. And in my opinion, it's your duty to exonerate me from their accusations because it's disrespectful of our political process is to just assign a duty to somebody who's a helpless, screaming child and say, play it again, Sam, because you feel like running a child pornography story called Good Conduct Well Chastised. Well, putting out films like Everything You Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask, which meant afraid to tell your mother. They had something called Guess What I Learned at School Today, which was another one of these obnoxious itinerary motion pictures from Hollywood, clocked to the Texas school book. And they're not legalizing sexual freedom. They're legalizing pimpery and tyrannical oversight through your home computer for control purposes that are illicit and which you're born to because of original sin. And they had a couple of movies I think need to be investigated above and beyond the reader made stuff that's all implicit in the script behind the smoke screen of this claims phony baloney about Lennon. Tommy Steele's film The Happiest Millionaire is one of it. Because as a child, I thought the happiest millionaire must be that super happy Tommy Steele, but it was that dour other guy. And Joe is another one, where I thought Joe must be that McCarthyite vigilante, but no, it's the father who he teams up with. So we need to look at the way that they pass around ideas through personas and question some of the seduction to imply that America can do things that we can't, or that we won't do things that we can, because it's very disturbing. And a lot of it is being passed through the academic system by UW Dialectical in a sort of nexus of tabloid ideas they call street scholars. I'll get back to all this, I want to think about it a little bit more. But don't fall for the shrill things that they justified using me for. You know, I was a very good, caring, gentle boyfriend. I gave my most innocent girlfriends goosebumps. But they had impacted a neuroplasm, and I wanted to know what was going on. And they set this intuitional clock of self destruction to the searing and shrill sound of that ghastly parochial Robert Fripp of the Ouspensky's Fourth Way. I don't see how the people who know what a struggle civil rights has been in America has been can dismiss that we still care about and contribute to the search for human rights, while allowing the wizards of the royal class to talk about being on the outside looking inside, sowing hatred for us in the name of songs like Baby, I'm a Rich Man, and bumper stickers like, and it doesn't matter if they're wrong, they're still right. What's that supposed to mean? They say people like me should be poisoned because we won't cooperate with their new idea until we're dependent on them too. It still sounds to me like good conduct, well chastised. We're dealing with sadists, not American values.